My mother once looked me straight in the eye and said, "If you're poor, you deserve to be invisible." She didn't whisper it. She didn't say it in private. She said it in front of people who smiled politely, while I felt myself shrink. For years, she never raised a hand to me. She didn't kick me out as a child. She didn't disappear. She did something quieter. She taught me to feel ashamed of existing without money. Every family gathering felt like a test I was meant to fail. My clothes, my job, my car, my life. And every time I came up short, she reminded me who I was to her. Nothing. But here's the part no one saw coming. Years later, when my mother was lying in a hospital bed, weak and frightened, the doctors didn't call her friends. They didn't call the relatives who praised her. They called me, because somehow, quietly, without her ever realizing it, I became the only person legally allowed to decide what happened next. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't smile. I didn't take revenge the way movies make it look. I did something far more powerful. I listened, and I let her words come back to her, one by one. Before we go any further, if stories about family betrayal, hidden wounds, and karma finding its way back speak to you, make sure you subscribe to this channel. That way, even if life pulls you away, you won't miss the ending of this story, or the others that might feel uncomfortably familiar. Now let me ask you something. What would you do if the person who spent your whole life humiliating you suddenly needed your mercy? Would you forgive them? Would you walk away? Or would you give them exactly what they taught you? Because there's one moment later in this story, one choice that no one in my family expected. I didn't understand it myself until it was already done. And even now, people still argue about whether what I did was cruel or finally fair. That moment is coming. But first, you need to understand how a mother can destroy her own child without ever believing she did anything wrong. When I was a kid, I didn't think my family was broken. I thought this was just how families worked. We lived in a small town where people smiled a lot and talked even more. Everyone knew everyone. Appearances mattered. What your neighbors thought mattered. And to my mother, nothing mattered more than how our family looked from the outside. We weren't always poor, but we were never comfortable either. Money came and went, usually faster than it arrived. When it left, my mother didn't panic out loud. She did something else. She tightened her jaw. She lowered her voice, and she watched me more closely. I was the quiet child, the one who stayed out of trouble, the one who learned early not to ask for things. I didn't need toys or brand name clothes. I just wanted peace. But peace made my mother uneasy. She believed struggle built character. At least, that's what she told other people. At home, struggle came with commentary. She'd look at my shoes before school and say, "Try not to embarrass me today." Not because they were dirty, not because they were falling apart, just because they weren't impressive. When report cards came home, she didn't ask how I felt. She asked how it would look. Why isn't this higher? Other kids are doing better. You're smart. There's no excuse. There was always no excuse. I learned quickly that love had conditions, and money was one of them. What confused me most was how different she was around other people. At church, she smiled. At school events, she volunteered. She helped neighbors who were struggling worse than us. People called her strong, selfless, a good mother. I watched her accept those compliments like they belonged to her. At home, she barely looked at me. When I tried to tell her, I felt small. She brushed it off. "You're too sensitive. Life is hard. I'm preparing you." Preparing me for what I never knew. Some nights, I lay awake listening to her talk on the phone in the kitchen, laughing, telling stories about sacrifice, about how hard she worked for her child. I was that child, and I didn't recognize the story. There was one memory that stayed with me longer than the others. I was maybe 10 or 11. We were at a family gathering. Everyone was eating, laughing, comparing jobs and plans. Someone asked me what I wanted to be when I grew up. Before I could answer, my mother laughed and said, "Well, let's hope something better than this." People chuckled. I smiled because I didn't know what else to do. Inside, something shifted. That was the first time I understood that my mother didn't just worry about money. She was afraid of being associated with lack, and I was proof of it. What I didn't know then, what I wouldn't understand for years, was that my mother had once been poorer than I ever was. She never talked about it, never admitted it. She rewrote her past the way she wanted others to see it. And somehow, in erasing her own shame, she handed it to me instead. At that age, I still believed things could change, that if I tried harder, stayed quieter, succeeded enough, she would soften. I didn't know yet that some parents don't want their children to rise. They want them to stay small, because small children don't remind them of who they used to be. And that belief, that hope, was about to cost me more than I could imagine. By the time I reached my late teens, money wasn't just a problem in our house. It was a measurement. It measured effort, it measured worth, and in my mother's eyes, it measured failure. I worked whatever jobs I could find. Grocery stores, warehouses, late shifts that left my hands sore and my back stiff before I was even old enough to complain about it. I never told her how tired I was. She never asked. If I came home late, she'd glance at the clock and say, "Is that all you're making for those hours?" Not, "How was work?" Not, "Are you okay?" Just numbers. The humiliation didn't happen all at once. It built slowly. Quiet comments, side glances, little jokes that didn't sound like jokes when they were aimed at you. Then came the night that changed everything. It was a family event. One of those gatherings where everyone dresses a little nicer than usual and pretends their lives are going better than they really are. I stood in the corner, holding a cheap paper plate, trying not to draw attention to myself. My mother, on the other hand, was in her element. She laughed louder than everyone else. She told stories. She introduced people. And when someone asked what I was doing these days, she answered for me. "Well," she said, smiling, "they're still trying to figure things out." Still, the word hung in the air. Someone joked, "Hey, we all start somewhere." My mother laughed again. "Yes, but some people stay there." The room chuckled politely. I felt my face burn. I wanted to disappear. Not dramatically, not in anger. I just wanted to stop being seen. Later that evening, she found me refilling my drink and said quietly, "You should try harder. This isn't a good look for the family." I stared at her. I wanted to ask what else I could do. I was working. I wasn't in trouble. I wasn't asking for money. But none of that mattered, because what she saw wasn't effort. She saw embarrassment. On the drive home, she didn't turn on the radio. She never did when she was disappointed. "You know," she said, eyes fixed on the road. "People notice these things. If you had tried harder, you wouldn't be in this position." I nodded, because nodding was easier than arguing. That night, I sat on my bed and stared at the wall. I replayed every moment, every laugh, every look, and something finally broke. Not loudly, not in tears, just a quiet understanding. My mother wasn't motivating me. She wasn't pushing me forward. She was separating herself from me. And the worst part, she didn't even realize how cruel it was. To her, shame was a tool, a way to force improvement. To me, it became a weight. After that night, I stopped talking about my life. I stopped sharing plans. I stopped dreaming out loud. If I got a small win, I kept it to myself. If I failed, I hid it, because every piece of information became ammunition. And my mother, she noticed the silence, but instead of concern, she seemed relieved, as if my quiet made things easier. I didn't know it then, but that night marked the beginning of something else. Not anger, not revenge, distance. And once distance settles in, it changes everything that comes after. What made everything harder wasn't just what my mother said to me. It was who she was to everyone else. Outside our house, my mother was admired, respected, trusted. At church, she sat in the front rows. She volunteered for charity drives. She organized meals for families who were struggling. People leaned toward her when they spoke. They listened. I watched strangers thank her for being so kind, so generous, so strong. And every time I wondered if we were talking about the same person, at home, kindness felt conditional. It depended on performance, on progress, on appearances. But in public, she wore compassion, like a well-fitted coat. Sometimes, she'd tell stories about me, stories that sounded loving, until you listened closely. I worry about them, she'd say. They have so much potential, but they just don't apply themselves. People nodded sympathetically. They praised her patience. I stood nearby, invisible again. One afternoon after a church event, a woman approached me and said, "You're so lucky to have a mother like that." I forced a smile and said thank you. What else could I say? I tried once to speak up. I was older by then, tired, careful with my words. I told my mother I felt embarrassed sometimes, that her jokes hurt. She looked at me like I had accused her of something unthinkable. "I do everything for you," she said. "I work hard. I sacrifice. And this is how you repay me." The conversation ended there. From that moment on, I understood something important. My mother didn't see herself as someone capable of harm. In her mind, she was the victim, the martyr, the parent burdened by an ungrateful child. Any criticism threatened the story, she told herself, and others. I started noticing the pattern. She was generous when there was an audience, supportive when it was visible, proud when it reflected well on her. But when the doors closed, her attention faded. I realized that her love wasn't absent. It was selective. She loved the version of me that didn't embarrass her, the version that made her look successful. Anything less, she kept at arm's length. What hurt the most was how easily people believed her version. If I looked unhappy, they assumed I was lazy, unmotivated, ungrateful. After all, how could a mother so respected be the problem? I stopped trying to correct the narrative. I learned that telling the truth doesn't matter when the audience has already chosen who they trust. There was one moment that stayed with me. A neighbor had fallen on hard times, lost a job, struggling to keep up. My mother organized help, food, clothes, support. I watched her hug that neighbor and whisper, "It's not your fault. Sometimes life is just unfair." That night, I sat across from her at the dinner table. I asked quietly, "Do you think life has ever been unfair to me?" She didn't answer right away. Then she said, "You need to stop seeing yourself as a victim." I understood then. Compassion to her was for people who didn't reflect her own fears. I wasn't her charity case. I was her reminder. And reminders like that were uncomfortable. So she kept polishing her image, and I kept learning how to survive without being seen. Neither of us realized how much that imbalance would matter later, when image would no longer protect her, and silence would no longer protect me. The distance didn't happen overnight. It grew slowly, like something that no one wants to name, but everyone feels. Conversations became shorter. Questions disappeared. Plans were made without me. At first, I told myself it was normal. I was older now, more independent. That's what my mother liked to say. "You need to learn to stand on your own," she told me one evening, her voice calm, almost proud. "I won't always be here." It sounded reasonable, responsible. What she didn't say was that she had already stepped back. Financial help stopped quietly. No arguments, no announcements. One month the assistance just wasn't there. I didn't ask why. I knew better. I adjusted my life downward. Smaller place, longer hours, fewer meals. When I mentioned working extra shifts, she nodded. and said, "That's good. Builds character." I was exhausted, but I kept my voice steady. Then came the moment that made everything clear. There was a family discussion. Nothing dramatic, just practical things, holidays, future plans. My mother spoke as if I wasn't in the room. "We can't keep supporting someone who isn't moving forward," she said. Someone asked, "What do you think?" She glanced at me briefly, then answered for me. "They understand." I didn't, but I nodded anyway. That was the night she said the words I still hear sometimes. "You're on your own now." Not angry, not cruel in tone, just final. I waited for someone to object. An aunt? A cousin? Anyone? No one did. Later, someone pulled me aside and whispered, "She means well. She's just tough." Tough. I walked home alone that night, the streetlights flickering above me. For the first time, I understood that family loyalty had limits. And I had crossed one. What hurt wasn't losing help. It was losing belonging. After that, I became a ghost in my own family. I wasn't invited to certain gatherings. When I was, I sat quietly at the edge. My mother introduced me less and less. When she did, it was vague. "This is my child." Nothing more. I started noticing how carefully she managed conversations around me. She didn't want questions. She didn't want comparisons. She wanted distance without confrontation. There was one person who tried to bridge the gap, an older relative, someone who remembered when I was younger, kinder. They once offered to help me with rent, just temporarily. My mother found out. She called me later and said, "I don't want the family thinking you can't handle your own life." That was the end of that. I didn't argue. I understood now that accepting help made her uncomfortable. It threatened the image she worked so hard to protect. So I learned to struggle quietly, to succeed silently, to fail without witnesses. Every time I thought things couldn't get colder, they did. And still a part of me hoped. Hoped that one day she would notice how hard I was trying. That she would soften. That she would say, "I see you." I didn't know then that the space she created wasn't temporary. It was preparation. Because before anyone could push me out completely, I had to learn how to stand alone. And that lesson would matter more than she ever imagined. Once I was truly on my own, everything became quieter. Not peaceful, just quiet. No one checking in, no one asking questions, no one reminding me who I was supposed to be. I moved into a small place that barely felt permanent. Thin walls, secondhand furniture, a mattress on the floor. It wasn't the kind of place you invited people to. It was the kind of place you disappeared into. I worked longer hours, sometimes 2 jobs, sometimes overnight shifts that blurred into mornings. I ate whatever was cheap, skipped meals when I had to, learned which bills could wait. I told myself it was temporary, but temporary has a way of stretching when no one is watching. The hardest part wasn't the money. It was the shame. I avoided family events, not because I was told to stay away, but because I didn't know how to show up empty-handed. Every time I thought about calling my mother, my chest tightened. What would I say? That I was tired, that I was scared, that I felt like I was sinking. She had made it clear. This was my responsibility now. So I stopped reaching out. Months passed, then more. No calls from her. No messages asking how I was holding up. If I showed up anywhere by coincidence, she acted polite, distant, like an acquaintance she used to know well. One night after a double shift, I sat alone in my apartment and stared at my phone. I realized something unsettling. If I disappeared, if I failed completely, she might not even know right away. That thought scared me more than any unpaid bill. Around that time, I hit what I can only describe as the bottom. Not one dramatic moment, just accumulation. An eviction notice that wasn't final yet, but close. A car that wouldn't start. A body that felt older than it should. I remember sitting on the edge of my bed, fully dressed, unable to move. I wasn't crying. I wasn't angry. I was empty. And in that emptiness, something shifted. I stopped asking why she treated me the way she did. Instead, I started paying attention. I replayed conversations in my head, not with emotion, but with clarity. I noticed patterns I hadn't seen before. How often money came up. How often embarrassment followed. How carefully she protected her image. And then I noticed something else. Small inconsistencies. She lived comfortably, more comfortably than I remembered. New furniture, quiet upgrades, no explanations. She never talked about finances, never worried out loud. But I knew how much she made. The numbers didn't add up. At first I told myself it was none of my business. Then I remembered how quickly she had cut me off, how firm she had been about independence. Something about that felt rehearsed, like a decision made long before it was announced. That thought stayed with me. I didn't act on it. I didn't confront her. I just stored it away, because at the bottom, you learn to observe before you move. I didn't know it yet, but this was the point where things stopped getting worse and started changing in a different way. Not upward, not yet, but inward. And that shift would eventually give me something I never expected. Leverage. Not the loud kind, not the cruel kind. The kind that comes from understanding the truth before anyone else realizes you do. Nothing changed all at once. There was no sudden breakthrough, no dramatic success story. What changed first was my pace. I stopped rushing, stopped chasing the idea that I had to prove something to someone who wasn't watching. I focused on stability, small steps, predictable routines. A steady job replaced the chaos of two. Not higher pay, just consistent hours. For the first time in years, I could breathe without counting every dollar in my head. I didn't tell my mother. I didn't tell anyone in the family. I had learned that progress made noise, and noise attracted judgment. So I kept quiet. I started paying attention to details at work, the paperwork others skipped, the rules people assumed didn't matter. It wasn't exciting, but it was important. Over time, I became someone people relied on, not because I talked the most, but because I didn't miss things. Eventually, I was offered a position that came with responsibility. Not power, not prestige, access, forms, authorizations, processes most people never thought about until they needed them. I didn't think much of it at first. It was just work. Meanwhile, my mother remained distant. We spoke occasionally. Short calls, neutral topics. She never asked about my job, never asked how I was managing. And I didn't volunteer the information. In her mind, I was still struggling, still behind, still the child who needed to try harder. I let her believe it. There was a strange comfort in being underestimated. Around that time, I noticed her health beginning to change. Not dramatically, subtle things. She canceled plans more often, complained about being tired, mentioned doctor visits without details. When I asked if everything was okay, she said, "It's nothing. I'm fine." I recognized that tone. It was the same one she used when she didn't want questions. Months passed. Then one afternoon, I received a call at work. A hospital number. At first, I thought it was a mistake. When I answered, the nurse asked my name and paused. "Are you related to?" she said. I said yes. There was a short silence before she continued. "You're listed as an emergency contact." I felt a strange mix of emotions. Confusion, concern, and something else I didn't name yet. They told me my mother had been admitted, that she was stable, that they needed someone to coordinate next steps. I drove there without thinking. When I saw her, she looked smaller, not weak, just human. She tried to brush it off. "I didn't want to bother anyone," she said. I nodded. That was familiar too. As the doctors explained her condition, they turned to me. They asked questions. They waited for answers. At one point, they handed me a form. I glanced at it casually, then froze. My name, not just as contact, as decision maker, legal authority. I didn't react. I didn't let my face change. I signed where they asked and handed it back. Only later, sitting alone in my car, did I fully understand what that meant. Somewhere along the way, quietly, without telling me, my mother had named me the person responsible if she couldn't decide for herself. I tried to make sense of it. Why me? Not the relatives she favored. Not the people who praised her. Not the ones who fit her image. Me, the poor one, the disappointment, the invisible child. I didn't feel powerful. I felt unsettled. Because with that authority came responsibility. And with responsibility came memory. Every comment, every dismissal, every moment she made me feel small. They were all there, waiting. I didn't act on anything. Not yet. I told myself this was about care, about doing the right thing. But something had shifted. For the first time in my life, the balance wasn't tilted against me. I hadn't taken anything from her. I hadn't planned this. But suddenly, I was standing in a place she never imagined I would reach. And she had no idea. That quiet misunderstanding, that gap between who she thought I was and who I had become, would soon matter more than either of us realized. After that hospital visit, I couldn't stop thinking about one thing. Not her illness, not the paperwork, but the question that wouldn't leave me alone. Why me? My mother had spent years keeping me at a distance. She trusted others with her image, with her pride. Yet when it came to something that truly mattered, she chose the child she had pushed aside. At first I told myself it was coincidence, convenience, but the feeling wouldn't settle. So I started paying closer attention, not out of suspicion, out of necessity. As her condition required more appointments, more coordination, more forms, I saw pieces of her life I'd never been allowed to see before. Bills, documents, statements. Nothing dramatic at first. Then patterns emerged. Accounts I didn't recognize. Transfers that didn't match her income history. Assets that didn't align with the story she had always told. I remembered the years she insisted there was nothing left. The way she cut me off so decisively. It hadn't been because there was nothing. It had been because there was something she wanted to protect. I didn't confront her. I didn't accuse. I just kept observing. One afternoon, while organizing paperwork, I came across a document that made my hands stop moving. An old legal agreement, dated years earlier. It involved money set aside, not for emergencies, not for family, for silence. I read it twice, then again. Slowly, the picture came into focus. Years ago, my mother had made a decision that could have ruined her reputation. One that conflicted with everything people believed about her. She had chosen self-preservation over responsibility, and she had paid to make sure it never followed her. That was the real reason she guarded her image so fiercely. That was why she feared embarrassment more than cruelty, because exposure would cost her everything. I finally understood something I had never allowed myself to consider. Her treatment of me wasn't random. I wasn't just unlucky. I was inconvenient. I reminded her of a version of herself she had buried, of a time when she chose comfort over courage. And she couldn't afford to be reminded of that. Suddenly the past made sense. Why she pushed independence so hard. Why she refused help for me. Why she made poverty feel like a moral failure. If I stayed poor, if I stayed quiet, if I stayed small, then nothing would threaten the story she had built. I felt sick, not angry, not vindicated, just deeply sad, because for the first time, I saw her clearly, not as a villain, not as a monster, as someone terrified of being exposed. I still said nothing. She was weaker now, more guarded. Sometimes she looked at me like she wanted to say something, then didn't. I wondered if she knew how much I had seen, or if she still believed I was unaware. The distance between us shifted again. This time, it wasn't cold. It was tense, like standing on opposite sides of a truth that hadn't been spoken. I started to understand the weight of what I held. Not power, not revenge. Information. And information, when paired with timing, is dangerous. I didn't want to hurt her, but I also knew something else. If the roles were reversed, if I were the one exposed, she wouldn't hesitate to protect herself. She had taught me that lesson my entire life. What I didn't know yet was that soon she would realize exactly how much I knew. And when she did, she would finally see me, not as a burden, not as an embarrassment, but as the person standing between her and the truth she had spent decades running from. My mother's health declined faster than anyone expected. One appointment turned into several. Several turned into stays that lasted longer than planned. The hospital room became familiar, too familiar. Machines hummed softly. Lights stayed dim. Time felt suspended. Family members visited when they could, some out of concern, some out of obligation. They came in groups. They spoke in careful tones. They avoided difficult conversations. And then they left. I stayed, not because anyone asked me to, not because I felt obligated, because I was already there. The doctors spoke to me directly, now. They explained options. They waited for my decisions. Each time I nodded, listened, asked questions. I did my best to separate memory from responsibility, but it wasn't easy. One afternoon, when the room was quiet and the curtain drawn, my mother looked at me differently. Not critically, not dismissively, carefully. "You've changed," she said. I didn't respond right away. I had to, I finally said. She studied my face, as if trying to match it to an older image. "I didn't realize you were doing so well," she said. There it was, the assumption that success would announce itself, that I would need her approval to reach it. I didn't correct her. Later that evening, a nurse handed me another set of forms. Choices, interventions, limitations. I read each one slowly. These weren't just medical decisions. They were moments where control shifted. I thought about the times she decided things for me without asking, the doors she closed, the help she refused. I didn't feel anger. I felt clarity. When I returned to her room, she noticed the folder in my hand. "What is that?" she asked. "Paperwork," I said. Her eyes lingered. For the first time, she seemed unsure. Days passed. Her strength faded. Her tone softened. She started asking questions she had never asked before. "Are you happy? Do you have people in your life? Did I push you too hard?" The questions came slowly, cautiously, as if she was testing whether it was safe to ask them. I answered honestly, not harshly, not defensively. "I survived," I said. She nodded. One night when the ward was quiet and the lights low, she reached for my hand. Her grip was weak. "I didn't mean to hurt you," she said. I believed that she believed it. But intention doesn't erase impact. "I know," I replied. She hesitated. "Can you forgive me?" I didn't answer. Not because I couldn't, because I didn't yet know what forgiveness would mean. The next morning, a doctor pulled me aside. He spoke carefully. There were choices to be made, paths that would lead to different outcomes. None of them were easy. I asked for time. I went outside and sat in my car. I didn't cry. I didn't pray. I thought about shame, about silence, about how power shifts quietly, just like damage does. When I went back in, my mother was awake. She watched my face closely. I realized then that she knew. She knew I wasn't powerless anymore. She knew I understood more than I had ever let on. And for the first time in my life, she was afraid of disappointing me. The irony wasn't lost on me, but neither was the weight of the moment, because the next choice I made would define not just how her story ended, but how mine would finally begin to heal. And whatever I chose, there would be no taking it back. I asked the doctors for a private moment. They nodded. They had learned by now that I didn't waste time. When I stepped back into the room, my mother was awake, staring at the ceiling. She didn't speak at first. Neither did I. Silence had always been our language. "I know you've been handling things," she finally said. "I'm grateful." The words sounded unfamiliar, coming from her. I pulled a chair closer and sat down. "I want to talk," I said. "Not about the hospital, about us." Her eyes shifted toward me, cautious, braced. I didn't accuse her. I didn't raise my voice. I reminded her, I reminded her of the comments about money, the jokes, the nights I went home feeling smaller than when I arrived. She tried to interrupt. I gently stopped her. Please, I said. Just listen. I told her about the nights I skipped meals, about the jobs I worked without telling her, about how silence had become safer than honesty. Her breathing changed. She closed her eyes. I thought I was making you strong, she whispered. I know, I said, but you were teaching me that love had a price. Tears slipped down her face. Not dramatic, just tired. Then I told her something I hadn't planned to say. I know about the money, I said. Her eyes snapped open. I didn't explain. I didn't threaten. I didn't need to. She understood immediately. Her face changed in a way I had never seen before. Fear. Not of death, of exposure. She opened her mouth, then closed it. I never wanted you to find out, she said quietly. I didn't go looking, I replied. I was just paying attention. The room felt heavy. I could have used that moment. Could have said more. Could have taken something back. But that wasn't why I was there. I'm not here to punish you, I said. I'm here to be honest. She looked at me, really looked at me. Not as a project. Not as a reflection. As a person. I was ashamed, she admitted. And I didn't know how to live with it. I nodded. Shame had shaped us both. The difference was, I had learned to carry it. She had buried hers. I stood up slowly. The choices ahead will be made carefully, I said. I'll do what's right, not what's easy. She reached for my hand again. This time I let her. I'm sorry, she said. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't complete. But it was real. In the end, the decision I made wasn't the one people expected. I didn't seek revenge. I didn't erase her. I made sure the truth existed. Not publicly, not loudly, but permanently. She would live with it. And so would I. But the weight wasn't the same anymore. Because for the first time, I wasn't carrying it alone. I left the room that day knowing something important. Karma doesn't always arrive as punishment. Sometimes it arrives as clarity. And sometimes the greatest power you gain is choosing not to become the person who hurt you. That was the choice I controlled. And it changed everything that came after. From a professional perspective, what you've just heard isn't a story about money. And it isn't really a story about revenge. It's a story about shame. In many families, especially those shaped by scarcity or fear of social judgment, shame becomes a parenting tool. Not because parents are evil, but because they never learned another way. When a parent ties love to success status or income, the child doesn't grow stronger. They grow quieter, more careful, more disconnected from their own worth. What makes this story so painful is also what makes it so common. The mother believed she was teaching resilience. In reality, she was teaching her child that being human wasn't enough, and the child learned to survive without being seen. Here's the part many people miss. Healing doesn't begin when the parent apologizes, and it doesn't require revenge. Healing begins when the child stops chasing validation from someone who can't give it. In this story, the power didn't come from control. It came from clarity. The moment the child understood the truth about the parent's fear, their hidden shame, their choices, the cycle broke. Not with punishment, but with boundaries. That is real karma. Not humiliation, not payback, but accountability without cruelty. If this story stirred something in you, a memory, a feeling, a question you've carried quietly, you're not alone. Many people over 50 grew up in families where emotions weren't discussed, and worth was measured by survival, not connection. Those wounds don't disappear with age. They just get quieter. Stories like this matter because they give language to experiences that were never acknowledged. If you found value here, take a moment to like this video. It helps these stories reach others who may need them more than they realize. And if you want to keep exploring stories about family betrayal karma and healing stories that don't rush forgiveness, but respect the truth, consider subscribing to this channel. That way, when you're ready, the next story will be waiting for you. Because no matter how long it takes to see it, your worth was never tied to what you could afford, and choosing not to pass on pain is one of the strongest decisions a person can make.